Hi, welcome back to the second half of Session 1 of History 3375, CIA in the Third World. The first half we went over the sort of nuts and bolts issues of exams and how to study for them, homework assignments, readings, etc. Now we want to start to get into the history of the jackhammer, which is going off over here. Now, seriously, we're going to talk about the history of the Third World and try to get an idea of some of the basic characteristics of Third World societies. Now, defining the Third World is in of itself kind of a challenge, and we can play all kinds of games as to what the Third World means. During the Cold War, the decades of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the argument was countries that were following a third way. Neither communism nor capitalism. Countries like India that were trying socialism or various types of nationalist economic policies, those were considered the Third World. In general, however, the Third World has usually referred to any societies that are not or have not yet achieved levels of economic development typical of those industrial and post-industrial societies such as the United States, Western Europe, Japan. These would be considered the key examples. So really, the major defining factor for much of the past half century or more has been the idea that the Third World is economically defined, those societies that we would not consider fully economically developed. However, when we look at the Third World, we discover that that in itself really tends to suggest that there's a certain uniformity to what we're going to talk about. That would you? We can take all those countries that are sort of not fully developed economically and call them the Third World. But when we look at countries that fit that description in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, we find that, well, they may have that characteristic in common, but other than that, they seem to have very little in common. I mean, languages vary from Spanish to Swahili, religious identifications from Christianity to Islam to Buddhism. We can look at key figures who have emerged on the world scene from third world countries over the past 5 or 6 decades and find people as radically different as Ho Chi Minh and Osama bin Laden. Both of these figures are people who established prominent positions in the world as leaders of radical movements in third world societies, and yet Ho Chi Minh was a communist, committed to the atheistic, materialistic views of communism. And Osama bin Laden, on the other hand, as an Islamicist who has a very radical interpretation of Islam, would be the absolute antithesis of Ho Chi Minh in the sense that he would utterly and completely reject all influences of communism and similar doctrines. In fact, Osama bin Laden comes to the forefront of world affairs when he involves himself in the Islamic struggle against the Soviet Union after it occupied Afghanistan during the 1980s. So here we have two people who we can both refer to as significant figures in third world history, and yet they are radically different in their political ideologies and their cultural perspectives. So we've got enormous diversity in that regard. The question is, other than saying, well, these countries haven't quite reached the levels of economic development that societies such as the United States and Japan have, other than that, is there something that pulls them together? Something that gives them a common perspective or common set of values? Is there anything we can use to say, well, these societies do have a similarity, other than, okay, their economies are not, at least as we see them, fully developed. Is there something that we can find in such diverse figures as bin Laden and Ho Chi Minh, with such cultural differences, with strong historical traditions that are often radically different from one another? Is there something that binds them together more than just a characteristic, an economic characteristic, but an experience that would give them a certain shared perspective, certain shared values, as different as these societies and these people appear to be? That commonality is their encounter with the West over the past 500 years. One thing that all of these societies that we commonly describe as third world societies have in common is that at some time during the past 500 years, for a significant period, their societies were dominated in one extent or another by Western countries. This might mean outright colonialism, that a Western country has come and seized this society, established total political and economic control, or it might mean a great deal less. China was never a colony of any Western society. But China, particularly in the second half of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century, was very much dominated by Western European countries, even though it was not technically a colony. So all of these societies have that common experience, although the precise form of domination has varied from area to area. So in trying to understand what kinds of common characteristics we might find in third world societies that would be relevant for us, because what we really want to know is, well, what is the significance of this in terms of how the United States and therefore the CIA might react to them over time? When looking for those kinds of common characteristics, the place we really need to begin is the historical background, the past 5 centuries of history of encounters between Western societies and these third world countries that are the focus of much of the course itself. And to do that, we're going to do for the second half of today is go through historically and look over the last 500 years and see what those encounters were like, what effect did they have on these societies, and ultimately, as we get to the latter part of this, how did these societies ultimately respond to those experiences? What kinds of values and perspectives did it leave these countries with? As diverse and different as they may be from one another, they do share this common experience, and it has given them certain common perspectives about the world in general. The first period we're going to talk about is a period, and again, I'm giving you dates here, but it's not like these are carved in stone. Nobody, put up a sign in the year 1450 and said, it's the start of the Age of Encounters. That's what I'm going to call it, and this period from about 1450 to 1700 is what I'm terming the Age of Encounters. These are just rough approximations, because we can look at this time period and see certain things that are happening that are very similar in different parts of the world. Now, if we look at the world at this time, in 1450, it looks very different than it will in the 19th and 20th centuries. If you were looking at the globe and wanting to emphasize where the important places were, where were the major empires, where were the major economic institutions and structures, where had cultures become highly developed and sophisticated, you wouldn't look at the West. Okay? The West is kind of a backwater, sitting out on the end of a peninsula at the end of the Eurasian continent. If you wanted to be at the heart of what were highly developed human societies and civilizations, the first place you go is China. Because China had this extraordinarily long history of political, economic, and cultural development. It had a long history of centralized government. And it was, without question, the most powerful political and economic entity on the face of the earth as of 1450. Another important place would be the Ottoman Empire, sitting at the end of the Mediterranean, with its capital in what is now modern-day Turkey, and spreading its influence over much of the Middle East and North Africa. There was another major empire, one that could muster enormous military power and commanded tremendous economic significance. There were other significant societies that had evolved and developed in northern Africa, trading empires, imperial systems in the Western Hemisphere, the Aztec and Inca empires. All of these were of substantial significance, although the Ottoman and the Chinese empires would be the ones that would really stand out. As for Europe, Europe hadn't been doing terribly well since the fall of the Roman Empire back in the 8th century. The European continent had become fractured into a series of very small principalities. Gradually, as we approach the 1300s and 1400s, we're getting the expansion of these principalities into kingdoms that have been heavily influenced by earlier migrations of nomadic people. Fun groups like the Vikings and the Goths, the Huns. What we have is a series of warrior states spending a good deal of time bashing each other's brains out. We call it chivalry. They called it bashing each other's brains out. We have a highly fragmented political structure, one with a great deal of political infighting, and a series of economies that are not especially highly developed. The greatest dynamism we would find in Italy, in the city-states in Italy, places like Venice and Florence and Naples. These were probably the most dynamic elements in European economies at this time. One thing that did hold the West together at this time, to a degree, was Christianity, that all of these societies shared common religious beliefs and specifically a fairly unitary structure in the form of the Catholic Church. However, even that, of course, by the early 1500s was going to start to fragment as the Protestant Reformation occurs and divides Christianity between Catholics and a variety of Protestant sects. Another thing that's distinctive about Europe at this time is the fact that merchants have considerably greater influence and latitude of activity than they do in other societies, probably in part because of the relative weakness of most of the political institutions. In China, for example, merchant activity is far more subordinated to the state and its power than it is in the West. Why? Because China has, and it has had, a powerful central government that can exercise considerable control over merchants. And also Chinese merchants, relatively speaking, were looked down upon within the social structure of China. But in the West, one of the other influences, or distinctive characteristics, is the particular influence that merchants have among the princes, among the political rulers of their time, largely because the merchants are a source of economic resource for these princes or kings when they want to go to warfare and go to war with each other and bash each other's brains out. You usually need a merchant to come along and help finance the war for you. So we have fairly fragmented political structure. We have a uniformity in religious belief, although there's going to be some division over that. And we have substantial influence by merchants, although these economies are not highly developed at this point compared to the dynamism of, say, the Ottoman Empire or the Chinese Empire at this time. However, despite what's a less than promising set of circumstances for the West, the truth is that by 1450, several of these societies are on the move and beginning an outward expansion, not necessarily in the form of direct territorial acquisition. That's going to take a while, but in the idea of exploratory ventures, looking for opportunities for trade, and reaching beyond their own borders and the immediate waters that surround them in Western Europe. The two that are going to lead this process are Spain and Portugal. Now, one of the things that determines that it will be Spain and Portugal that lead this expansion by the West is what is called the Reconquest. In the centuries leading up to, let us say, 1450, we're just using approximate dates here, in the centuries leading up to that time, Spain and Portugal most of their territory, had been occupied by Muslim societies, Muslim groups that had migrated across North Africa and occupied much of what's called the Iberian Peninsula, the place where Spain and Portugal are. However, for the 3 or 4 centuries leading up to 1450, small Christian principalities in the northern part of Spain and Portugal, near the border with France, had been fighting to drive out the Islamic societies and reestablish their own power. This is what was called the Reconquest, reconquering their territories. One of the things that the Reconquest did, it added on to what was already a merger between Christian beliefs and military expeditions. The West had already, in previous centuries, launched crusades against Islamic societies in the Holy Lands. But now we have 2 European societies, 2 European states that are literally being created through these military activities and are drawing upon Christianity as a particular inspiration. So these 2 societies, we see a particularly close attachment between the crown, the king or queen, and the Christian church, which provides the ideological justification to reconquer these territories. That this is more than just, well, we're seizing the land back from the Muslims, but that we're on a religious crusade. We're returning these lands to the control of Christianity, spreading the word of Christianity. That will be an important influence in what the Spanish and the Portuguese will do. At the same time, the Reconquest also means that these particular kingdoms have very strong centralized governments compared to the other principalities and kingdoms in Europe. Why? Because only by creating a strong centralized government could they succeed in achieving the Reconquest. Somebody had to be in charge. There had to be essentially a military commander, the king or queen, that was running this operation. So when Spain and Portugal emerge as independent states, by the 1400s, they have very strong centralized governments, compared at least to what's going on in the rest of Europe. This is important because we now have an ideological inspiration for expansion, this close connection with Christianity and the Reconquest, and we have centralized governments. They're important because if you're going to try overseas expeditions, whether you're just sailing across the ocean or planting a colony somewhere, you have to have a centralized state that makes it possible. Individuals aren't going to do it on their own. They're not going to be able to do it on their own. You're going to need a state that has the power and the determination to do that. Now, Portugal is the first one to get rolling. The Portuguese are going to establish a trading empire. They will spend 1400s, 1500s exploring the coast of Africa and establishing what they call, or what translates into the term factories. What a factory was an armed merchant community. In other words, it's a military garrison that carries out mercantile activities. Now, along the coast, down the west coast of Africa, and then up through the east coast of Africa, in later decades, through the Middle East, on to India, and even as far away as China, the Portuguese established this incredible network of trading outposts to conduct trade with a variety of societies in Africa and the Middle East, in India, and even with the Chinese Empire. So they have this vast extension, but it is not a territorial empire. They don't have the capacity to conquer most of the societies that they encounter. And therefore, what they are focused on is simply establishing a series of trading relationships. They will try, of course, to monopolize certain goods, establishing or trying to establish a monopoly on the trade in spices coming from the Far East, etc. But theirs is truly a trading empire. Now, the Spanish, on the other hand, take a different course, even though the basic motivating factors and the basic preconditions of Christian influence, the idea of tied to military expeditions, the idea of a strong central government that can fund such expeditions. They share this in common with the Portuguese, but their experience will be different. As you probably know, because it's all part of American history as well, Columbus convinces Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain, that he can reach the Far East by sailing west. That's because either he didn't know what he was talking about or he was lying, because everybody else knew, at least well-informed scholars knew that the world was much too wide to carry out such an expedition. But fortunately for Columbus, he runs into the Western Hemisphere. He runs into North and South America. And there, of course, the Spanish will encounter highly developed indigenous empires. The Aztecs in Mexico, the Incas in South America. They will conquer these and other indigenous peoples, who probably numbered at least 25 million people when the Spanish arrive, and establish an enormous land-based empire that runs ultimately from Alaska all the way down through what is now the western United States to the southern tip of South America. So it's an enormous land-based empire that they create in this period. In sharp contrast, of course, to what the Portuguese had done with their trading outposts stretched across thousands of miles of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. I should say the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Here, what the Spanish are able to do is extract huge amounts of wealth from silver and gold mines in the Western Hemisphere. This becomes the basis of an enormous fortune that will be brought back from the Western Hemisphere and fund Spain and its imperial pretensions for the next several centuries. Now, the driving forces here for these initial expansions are God and gold. God, because the Spanish and the Portuguese saw themselves, again, on a mission to spread Christianity. This was part of the Christian message, that you should go and teach all nations. And the Spanish and the Portuguese saw themselves as participating in that very process. This becomes their ideological inspiration. Now, of course, they weren't too nice about it at times. The Spanish had something they called a requirement, which means they went up to a group of Native Americans and read in Spanish to them the requirement that they all obey the King of Spain and convert to Christianity. And when the Native Americans looked around and said, "We don't know what you're talking about because we don't speak Spanish," they would shoot the Native Americans and then Christianize them. But they did see themselves on this religiously inspired mission to spread Christianity. There's also a practical side, however, and that, of course, is to gain wealth. And in fact, the Spanish and the Portuguese, and indeed other Europeans that come somewhat later, are being driven by a particular economic concern. And that is that if we looked at a map of the world at this time, the important economic activity going on is running across North Africa, through the Middle East, across what is now northern India, and into China. This is the great set of Silk Roads, as they're known, in Asia. These are the great trade routes, with precious goods being exchanged, gold, silver, horses, silks, spices, you name it, across this vast expanse stretching from northern Africa all the way to the furthest reaches of the Chinese Empire. That's where stuff is happening. The Europeans have at times been a part of this. They've been able to trade. The Venetians and others traded through the Middle East and tapped into this incredible set of economic exchanges. But a problem has arisen called the Ottoman Empire, which has basically become the 800-pound gorilla of world trade. The Ottomans are sitting at the end of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they are really at the nexus, the interchange point for all this trade coming east and west. And now that their power is increasing, they really don't want the Europeans to be sharing in this trade. The Venetians will spend a lot of time, a lot of money, trying desperately to break the Ottoman blockade, and will essentially expend their wealth and waste their wealth trying to do that. So the Spanish and the Portuguese, what they're looking for is a way around this blockade. That's why the Portuguese went down the coast of Africa and then onto India and China. To get around this, they could trade with African empires, and they could trade with empires in India, China, and elsewhere, because they could get around that blockade. Basic idea Columbus was trying was the same thing. Well, we'll go west. That way we can get to China and Japan. He tries to convince Ferdinand and Isabella, for example, that Cuba is Japan. Bad sense of geography. But in any case, that was the goal. I mean, if you didn't find Japan and China, you weren't worth anything. Fortunately for him, of course, he found these very wealthy empires in the Western Hemisphere. But both of them are driven by the same basic economic commercial need to get around the Ottoman blockade and tap into world trade networks that exist in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Now, with all of that said, with this age of encounters that occurs, you may well ask at this point, okay, so what? Why do we care about this stuff? What does that have to do with the Third World and the CIA? What we have to look at through this and the later periods is what are the effects of this? I mean, what we're looking at, Africa, Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, are what are going to become Third World societies. In the Western Hemisphere, for centuries, these societies would be under Spanish control. Although the Portuguese initially come simply to trade, as we will see, they will have long-term impact and ultimately create colonies in Africa. So many third world countries first experience the West in this period of encounters and first experience subordination to the West. In the Western Hemisphere, the most striking impact of the arrival of the West in the form of the Spanish was what is called the demographic disaster. Basically what happened is that between 1500, just after Columbus showed up, and 1650, 150 years later, the population of the Western Hemisphere declined by 90%. So if we estimate that around 25 million people in the Western Hemisphere, give or take 10 or 12 million, but around 25 million, if there were 25 million when Columbus showed up, 150 years later, there'd be about 2.5 million, which means a heck of a lot of people died. A heck of a lot more people were dying than were being born. Aside from the usual acts of brutality and warfare, the largest single factor that caused this demographic disaster was disease. The people of the Western Hemisphere had evolved over thousands of years with no contact with people from Eurasia or Africa. They were unexposed to the various plagues that spread across Eurasia and Africa in the thousands of years leading up to Columbus's voyage. So when the Spanish showed up in the Western Hemisphere, they are seething with diseases. To look at the typical Western European in 1492, okay, when Columbus showed up, would be a pretty revolting experience for people in the 21st century. You'd find that most people in Western Europe were covered with sores, lesions, open wounds. Their teeth were falling out. They were often losing their hair and were disfigured because they had been drinking quicksilver, mercury. This was a cure. You drank this stuff, not to kill yourself, supposedly, but to cure yourself of venereal disease. So Europeans were just, seething with diseases. Smallpox, various kinds of venereal disease, and these diseases devastated the populations of the Western Hemisphere and radically altered their composition for the future. And it also established, of course, over the next few centuries, a system of exploitation in which the Spanish created a colonial empire that consistently exploited the material resources of the Western Hemisphere or what we now call Latin America. The African experience of the Portuguese is, of course, very different in the sense that the Portuguese didn't come looking for conquest, looking for trade. However, their experience in Africa was particularly notable because when they arrive at the Congo River in South Central Africa, the ruler of the Kingdom of the Congo, what's called the Mani Congo, welcomes them with open arms, wants them to be his allies, accepts Christianity. They didn't try to force it on him. He volunteered to become a Christian, make his whole family Christian. And established close ties with the Portuguese. Now, why would he do that? Well, without getting into the complexities of this particular African society, the Mani Congo was thinking strategically. First of all, his decisions as king or emperor were subject to oversight by local religious leaders. If he became a Christian, he no longer had to listen to the local religious leaders. I'm a Christian now. Sorry, don't have to listen to you. And as far as the Pope goes, the Pope's thousands of miles away, so he doesn't have to worry about having his decisions reviewed by the Pope. So this was one way of achieving political independence for himself. And secondly, the Europeans brought weapons, firearms, that would give him an enormous advantage over his competitors in the region. So for both of those reasons, he embraces the Portuguese. Unfortunately, over time, and here we're talking the next several centuries, this also made the local ruler dependent upon the Portuguese. His legitimacy, his right to rule, and his ability to rule, to exercise power through the control of Western weapons, was dependent upon the Portuguese. And over the next several centuries, the Kingdom of the Congo and other West African societies will find themselves subordinated to the Portuguese. So the story starts off differently between what the Portuguese do in Africa and what the Spanish do in the Western Hemisphere. But ultimately, it winds up with Western domination of societies in both the Western Hemisphere and Africa. Now, this is not the experience of much of the rest of the Third World at this time. If we look at India, the Ottoman Empire, the Chinese Empire, neither the Portuguese nor the Spanish were going to come to dominate these societies. These were, as we've seen, enormous, powerful political, economic, military entities, and they remained free of Western control, and their relationships with the West varied, but essentially there was limited trade between these imperial systems and the Westerners. But at this time, at least, this is not a set of areas where Westerners can exercise any kind of direct control. They are usually there only because they're allowed to be there. You know, when the Portuguese show up in India, they have to ask permission, can we set up a trading position, etc. Same thing in China, and sometimes the Chinese threw them out depending on how things were going domestically. So this experience of subordination to the West and colonialism, which begins very early in the Western Hemisphere, later in Africa, is something that at least up until 1700, the rest of the world has not experienced. Now, the second era of Western expansion and encounters with the West is what's termed the era of mercantilism. It runs roughly from 1700 to 1815. And mercantilism simply means the establishment of long-term colonial systems with closed trading networks to benefit the mother country. A simple explanation is the relationship that Britain had with her colonies in North America. Britain sends over manufactured goods that the colonies need. The colonies, in turn, send back raw materials, if you will, primary products, tobacco, rice, other agricultural products, to the mother country. The colonies are only allowed to trade with the mother country. and the colonies wind up paying top dollar for the goods they import, and they are given the lowest possible price for the goods that they sell to England. This is the way mercantilism worked. The idea was the mother country benefits by having the colonies. We got a closed trading system, and it's always worked, rigged, so we benefit. That was the kind of system that was generally being set up in the 1700s, whether we're talking about Spain and the New World, Portugal and its colonies, and then England and France and other European countries as they establish their early colonial systems. They were based on this mercantilist principle. Something else that's happening besides this sort of regularization of these unequal trading networks is that Spain and Portugal are beginning to fade as colonial powers for a variety of reasons that we're not going to get into again because it's not really a course about colonialism or European expansion. And England and France are emerging as the new, more dynamic, more powerful European powers that are infringing on the interests of the Spanish and the Portuguese. For the British in particular, their major conquests come in North America, where they set up colonies in both what is now Canada and the United States, and India. Gradually, during the 1700s, as the old empire in India begins to disintegrate, the British gradually encroach and take greater and greater control over the Indian subcontinent until it becomes, in effect, a total British colony, and indeed the most important colony that Britain will have over the next several centuries. Now, what's the impact of these developments? We saw how drastic the impact could be of the early encounters, such as the conquest of the New World, the demographic disaster, and even the encroachment of the Portuguese gradually into African societies. Here, although the changes seem to be more subtle, establishing more regularized, closed trading systems, nevertheless, the impact is powerful because here is a period when a series of economies in the world, such as India's, are being refocused to become export economies dependent upon Western markets. For many of these societies, up until this time, they were largely subsistence economies. And while trade might be important, trade was still a small part of their economic activity. Now, under these mercantilist systems, countries like India are being transformed into outright export economies. In other words, the main focus for economic activity is going to be the development of products that can be exported to Western societies. This is important in the 18th century as the Industrial Revolution gets underway. England needs things like cotton, raw materials to feed its industrial system, to feed its textile industry. Over time, they also need places to sell the excess product that they are producing in their factories. In India, again, as the prime example, although we'll see others in later periods, the British deliberately rig the trade system to discourage domestic industry in India, such as the production of textiles, so that India will become a major market for British textiles, so that a colony like India can serve both as a source of raw materials for European industry and as a market for the excess product of those same industrial establishments. This means that third world countries are going to emerge in later centuries with economies that are largely focused not on domestic industrialization and sort of self-sustained growth, but on the production of a few primary products which are then to be exchanged for industrial goods. That is going to have a major impact on the economic histories of these societies, especially in the 20th century. Now, the next period of this set of encounters with the rest of the world is what's known as the era of free trade, which runs, again, roughly from 1815 to 1882. There are reasons for using those two dates, but they're not really essential to us in terms of what we're doing. What happens in this period is that the British establish a policy of encouraging free trade in the world, the exact antithesis of what had been developing since 1700. They want to dismantle these mercantilist systems, these closed trading systems that exist with other societies, as long as it's in the British interest. In other words, what the British are saying is that the best way for economies to function is to open them up, and this is common philosophy today as well, to open them up to international trade. Instead of having closed trading systems, we should have an open international exchange of goods based on the writings of people like Smith and Ricardo, the arguments that free markets function most efficiently, that the best thing to do is to rely on comparative advantage. In other words, if India is most efficient at growing cotton and we are most efficient in manufacturing textiles, that's what we should do, and then we'll exchange cotton for textiles. This way, both sides will benefit by taking advantage of their relative strengths. That's the theory. Now, what's important to note here is the British had no intention of opening up someplace like India. When they said to open up the world economy, they meant open up that part of the world economy that we don't control. The logic behind this was that by the beginning of the 19th century, the British were by far and away the most important economy on the face of the earth. They had led the Industrial Revolution. Other countries were beginning to industrialize, but they were pretty far behind the British. The British had the largest merchant marine in the world. The British had in London the financial center of the world. The British had the largest navy in the world, or I should say the most powerful navy. Might not be the largest in terms of sheer numbers. So in other words, the British found themselves in a position that the United States would later find itself in the second half of the 20th century, and particularly in the last decades of the 20th century, and that is we're the only game in town globally. Okay? Nobody else is even a close second. So what we would like to do is to compete, because we know nobody can compete. What they really want is for other societies around the world to open themselves up to free trade, places that the British don't control, because they know that other industrializing countries really can't compete with them, and those markets will clearly fall to the British. Now, they do find an ideal partner for all of this in Latin America. The places that the Spanish had conquered during the early 1500s had now emerged as a series of independent nations as they broke away from Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. And here, the British philosophy of free trade found a willing audience in those groups who now ruled Latin America. Rulers in Latin American countries looked at this and said, well, you know, given their own past experience as part of the mercantilist system of the Spanish, they had economies that produced things like cotton, sugar, coffee, metals or ores like copper, etc. They were primary product producers. And the people who ran these countries controlled the plantations and the mines that produced those goods. So to them, this makes perfect sense. We'll ship our coffee and our sugar and these other products to England in exchange for industrial goods. We'll get cheap industrial goods that are being manufactured efficiently in exchange for the products that we produce. So there the British had no problem. They were easily able to establish a good relationship with Latin American countries and establish free trade, or what approximated free trade relationships. However, not everyone was in quite such a receptive mood. They had a bit of a problem with China. Now, China, by the beginning of the 19th century, is a shadow of its former self. What had been this once powerful empire had severely declined for a variety of reasons, having to do with rapid demographic growth, a failure to keep up in terms of technological innovation, a weakening of existing political systems, such as the administrative system of the empire. There were a lot of reasons why this had happened. So China was not in a position to simply fend off, as it had in the past, initiatives from the West. However, there was one initiative that the Chinese felt they could not accept under any circumstances. The British are trading with China at this time, but they have a problem. They have become major customers for certain Chinese products, particularly tea. The British by now, of course, are now known as, this nation of tea drinkers. And indeed, much of what they are drinking, they're importing from China. And they are also importing things like silks and porcelains, etc., but particularly tea. So huge amounts of product are flowing out of China into Great Britain. However, the Chinese aren't that terribly interested in what the British produce. The Chinese produce fine silks. The British produce cheap cotton textiles. There isn't a large market for what the British have to offer. And so we have a situation where there's an extreme imbalance of trade. The British are buying all kinds of goods, shipping off silver to pay for it, China, and yet they are unable to earn that money back by selling a comparable number of goods to the Chinese. So they're looking for something to balance the trade. What can they sell in China that would help balance the trade? And the answer is drugs, specifically opium. In the northern part of the Indian subcontinent, which the British control, there has long been opium production. And the British logically look at this and say, well, if we took that opium from the northern parts of the Indian subcontinent and sell it to the Chinese, then we'd get that money and we'll take it back to England and balance the trade. Okay, so we'll be selling almost as much value as we're buying from the Chinese. Now, opium use had long been a problem in China, down through the centuries. It had become more acute as the Chinese institutional system of government and its economy ran into problems. More people were turning to its use. And the imperial government was, of course, anxious to try to stem the use of opium. And they had, in fact, sent out various commissioners to try to suppress the use of opium in China. This is happening in the late 1830s, just when the British are saying, we'd like to sell opium there. The Chinese, in fact, have restricted the British and other Westerners to limited trade in China. They can come to one port, they can trade during a certain season, and then they have to leave. The last thing that the Chinese want is for the British now to come and not just be trading, for silks, etc., but to be selling opium. Despite Chinese resistance, the British merchants begin selling opium anyways, and in response, the Chinese government arrests those people, and war breaks out. In 1839, the Opium War. The British launch a series of naval expeditions against China and inflict enough damage to finally force the Chinese to capitulate in 1842 and accept the opium trade. More than the opium trade, they also agreed to open more ports, and They give long-term control of Hong Kong, this key outpost, to the British. So suddenly, the Chinese, who weren't so crazy about free trade, find it forced upon themselves when the British attack them and essentially force them to open their doors to this system. So the period of free trade that reigns during most of the 19th century is in some ways, in some areas like Latin America, accepted willingly by some third world societies. But elsewhere, as in China, where there's resistance, the answer is, well, if you resist, then we can always use military pressure to bring it about. What the era of free trade does in terms of third world societies is that it tends to reinforce, first of all, places like Latin America, the predominance of the traditional elites, particularly the landowning elites, people who own large plantations and haciendas, who grew agricultural products for export. Their position is reinforced because here is the ideal economic situation for them. They don't have to modernize. All they have to do is continue producing these products that they have been producing for decades, if not centuries, and now they can exchange those for modern industrial goods and continue with their way of life. Another thing that it does, besides reinforcing the power of these traditional groups, is that it tends to frustrate industrialization. It's very difficult if you look at, for example, the history of the United States. When the United States is industrializing in the 19th century, the United States throws up a series of protective tariffs to inhibit the import of industrial goods precisely from Great Britain and other industrial powers, because they know that their industry, as it gets started, will not be as efficient as long-established industries in Great Britain and elsewhere. So for a time, they need to protect these domestic industries until they're strong enough to compete internationally. But for those societies that bought into or were forced to accept, as in China, free trade, this is an enormous discouragement to industrialize, because if you try to establish an industrial plant, you're going to have to compete almost immediately with cheap goods flowing from Britain or other Western societies. Now, of course, there are still going to be areas where you can industrialize. For example, if you want to make a brick factory, that'll work, because it's kind of inefficient to be shipping bricks across the ocean. Food processing works the same way. But in other areas, if you try to establish a steel plant, an iron plant, a railroad building factory or something, that's not going to work, because you're going to be outcompeted. So third world societies now have not only economies that are focused on export, but also economies where there is discouragement of industrialization and where traditional elites, like the old planter elite in the American South, are encouraged to survive and to continue and maintain power. There's also another factor that enters into the process at this time, and it is a sense in many of these societies of cultural inferiority. That what is increasingly taking hold in the world at this time, by the 19th century, are Western ideas about progress and development, and the tendency to measure other societies by the extent to which they have achieved what Westerners define as progress and development, particularly industrialization. So more and more in non-Western societies, as people look at their own cultures, they often, though not always, but often they tend to be highly critical of their own cultures, because if this is the standard by which we are to measure the achievements of human societies, particularly things like industrialization, obviously the West is far ahead of us in that regard. Military might, which grows out of industrial power, is another example of this. We indeed must be inferior, at least in some way, that our societies have not achieved that kind of development, that kind of progress, as has been defined in the West. And it's clear that indeed Western societies have the fastest growing economies, they have the greatest military power. So there is often a growing sense of inferiority when people in third world societies compare themselves to the West. Those kinds of problems are going to be exacerbated in the final era of Western dominance that stretches pretty much from 1882 to 1945, although it's not like Western dominance, suddenly comes to an end in 1945. But this period in particular, from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, was sort of the peak of Western domination, the era that is most commonly referred to as the era of colonialism, even though we can go back and say, well, look, the Spanish had colonies in the 1500s, and the French and the Spanish had them in the 1700s. This new era is the one that is most commonly referred to as the era of European colonialism. And one of the reasons for that is that it seems to mark a striking reversal from what Western initiatives were earlier in the 19th century. Remember, we just finished this period of free trade where the British, and to a lesser extent the Germans and the French, were doing some of this as well, talking about free trade. I mean, they did lower trade barriers between themselves, the different industrial powers. The competition seemed to be that Europeans were now competing with each other based on who could industrialize fastest, who could get the most markets, who could outcompete the other economically. That seemed to be the focus. And then suddenly, in the latter part of the 19th century, the Europeans seemed to go nuts and throw that all away and start seizing huge parts of the globe again. They simply took over all of Africa, or almost all of Africa, in a matter of a couple of decades. They just started seizing huge parts of territory and absorbing millions of people into these imperial systems. Now, why did that happen? A lot of it has to do with, first of all, the British, who were the only game in town through much of the 19th century, who could promote free trade because they figured they'd come out ahead in any head-to-head competition. It's not that the British aren't still number one in the late 19th century. They are. The Americans won't replace them until early in the 20th century. But the fact is, other countries are getting closer. It's not number one and everybody else, there isn't even, after win, there's no place in show, nobody's a close second. Now, by the late 19th century, the Germans are catching up, the Americans are coming on fast, and the French have certainly closed the gap to a degree. Suddenly, the British have real competition in terms of who's the most powerful country economically in the globe. Furthermore, so therefore the British, free trade only sounds good when you're pretty sure you're going to win. Furthermore, the level of competition had increased in this sense, that now competition, which in the 18th century might be among a variety of small family-controlled mercantile establishments, now we have a modern industrial corporations that are competing with each other internationally. Enormous corporations. The Imperial Chemical Company of England that controls half of all the industrial chemicals produced in the world. Half. But there's one company. These are huge corporations, and they are competing with each other internationally. From the perspective of European governments, they can't afford to let one of their huge corporations fail in this competition. If a giant British or German corporation collapses because it's been undone by competition with a foreign corporation, tens of thousands of jobs could be lost, millions and millions of dollars in capital will be wiped out. It would be a tremendous blow to the national economy. So governments are anxious to assist these corporations in this competition. Another factor, but where does that lead us? Well, in terms of assisting these corporations, what they want to do is find markets for their products and also guarantee them access to cheap raw materials. The argument is that can be done most efficiently by seizing new territories, creating new colonies. If you own a part of Africa, then clearly you can dictate how cheap raw materials will be that are shipped out of that place that you own. If you own a part of Africa, you can sell goods there and control the market because you can keep everybody else out. So governments are going to be looking for opportunities to control areas where they can ensure cheap raw materials for export to their economies and where they can ensure a market to sell the products of their industries. In addition to that, there is the issue of racism. By the late 19th century, racism was one of the most influential intellectual trends in the West, not only in Europe but in the United States. The belief that humankind could be divided up into a series of physiologically distinct races, which in turn could be ranked in terms of levels of superiority and inferiority. And of course, inevitably, in the West, the superior race was seen to be the white race. This gave an ideological motivation to colonialism because the argument was, well, we have these inherently inferior people. They need someone to take care of them. And since we are the superior race, it's our responsibility to go out and control them so we can lift them up at least from the very low status that they have or condition that they have as members of this inferior race, whether they're, brown, black, yellow, doesn't make any difference. They're all inferior to one degree or another. There is also, as a part of this, the theory of social Darwinism, that in fact the way that humanity advances is through competition among the races, with the inevitable result that the superior race, again, read white, will come through competition, warfare, to dominate these other races, and that is what is intended by nature for the betterment of humankind. So these provide powerful ideological motivations for seizing areas and imposing direct Western control, not only over economies, but political systems as well. Now, we talked about the economic factor, which is certainly an important one, but if it were the only immediate driving cause, many of the territorial acquisitions during this period of imperial expansion couldn't really be explained. I mean, there were a lot of areas that the European sees, and it's like a desert. So you say, well, there's no resources there. There aren't even any people to sell anything to. So why are they taking that? Another factor that's influencing them is what we term disintegration in the periphery. In other words, in parts of the world, places like Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, there is acute instability occurring. Let's use the example of Africa. The British seize a territory along the Niger River on the west coast of Africa. And then we find they keep moving inland, taking more, taking more. Why are they doing this? They're doing it because there is instability. They take a piece, let's say on the coast, and then they find, well, the immediate bordering area, there's hostile tribes or groups that are attacking us, that are interfering with trade routes that we have to the interior. So now we have to seize that territory and seize more territory. In Africa, centuries of the slave trade had acutely destabilized societies as millions of people were dragged off, both by other Africans and by Europeans, into slavery. That instability was marked in the 19th century and the early 20th century by frequent attacks on Western attempts to control certain key locations. So the Europeans expanded not just to seize Area A because it's economically important, but B and C because they border on A and they're unstable. China, not a place, again, where colonialism took place, but where the Europeans come to dominate, particularly coastal China. The seemingly innocuous intensification of trade relationships between China and the West as a result of the Opium War had given new status and power to merchants. That, adding to the existing problems in Chinese society, led to power struggles in China. Merchants had long been excluded from political power. Now they're demanding a role in political power. Now they're fighting with the traditional political elites over gaining access to power, even as unrest is occurring in the country due to demographic problems, due to a breakdown in political structures. Now, this reinvigorated, expanded, empowered merchant class is causing a split among the groups at the top, destabilizing or further destabilizing China. It certainly wasn't the only factor. What happens? The Europeans move in and establish protectorates over key Chinese coastal cities. So aside from the economic push to gain markets and resources, there was the fact that the Europeans were also responding to destabilization, which in many cases had part of its root in earlier experiences. In Africa, the slave trade came with them, which the West accelerated, didn't come with the West. In China, the empowerment of merchants. So we see a variety of factors that push the Europeans into all-out colonialism in this period. As a result, we have Africa overrun. England alone adds 4 million square miles of territory and 66 million people to its territorial empire during the late 19th and early 20th century. What are the effects of this final surge of colonialism? Believing they are on a mission of uplift, the Europeans will bring a new, expanded effort to Christianize populations and a limited effort at education. I say limited because in most instances what the Europeans were doing was not mass education. What they were doing was educating a small part of the population to use as colonial administrators. For example, in India, that was the purpose of education in India, was to educate a very tiny fraction of the population so those people could then assist in the administration of the imperial system. Certainly there is a strong experience for people in third world countries of Western racism and often of brutality in the creation of these empires. And there is, furthermore, the intensification of the system of export economies designed to produce primary products and exchange them for industrial goods produced in the West. Now, all of this, leading up to this point in the 20th century, we've been talking largely about, okay, what has the West been doing in its experiences with other societies, third world societies? Haven't talked much about response. This era of colonialism brings a response. In some ways, people in third world societies will absorb a considerable part of Western values and ideas. Over a series of centuries, the Western ideas about liberal institutions, elected governments, individual rights have a powerful impact upon people in third world societies. But at the same time, it also leads these people, particularly by the era of colonialism, to contest European domination. And many of the people who rise up to contest Western domination in the 20th century draw on Western ideas to refute Western claims to a right to dominate them. If you look at some of the major leaders of third world resistance like Gandhi, we find time and again that these people are educated in the West. And they, as much as they will draw on their own cultural roots, they draw on Western ideas and say, well, look, you people say that you believe in representative government, individual rights, and nationalism, the existence of the independent nation state. Okay, fine. We believe in all those things too. Now we'd like to have it here, okay, in India. We'd like to have it here in Vietnam. Okay, we'd like to have it here in South Africa. So they take many of these Western ideas and they absorb many of them, in part because they find these ideas attractive, but they also use them to fashion their own philosophies to challenge the right of the West to dominate them. In the 20th century, a series of movements emerge that begin this challenge. In fact, even in the late 19th century, in Egypt, for example. In the late 19th century, there was a movement called the God and Fatherland Party. The God and Fatherland Party was an early effort by Egyptian intellectuals and bureaucrats to challenge the right of the British to control Egypt as a colony. Another movement, and we'll come back to this, I'm only going to make passing reference to it today, but it is important, was one called the Muslim Brotherhood, which still exists in Egypt today. The God and Fatherland Party talked about nationhood. So it clearly was rooted in Western ideas about nation. The Muslim Brotherhood focused on Islam as its central tradition and as its way of challenging Western domination. So we get two different ideological streams challenging the West. One that does root itself in certain Western ideas about nationhood, but another one that turns back to Islamic roots to challenge the West. In China, if you've studied American history, you've probably seen a little bit about the Boxer Rebellion in 1911 in China. The Boxer Rebellion was one of a series of indigenous rebellions in China against Western control, rejecting what they felt were the corrupting influences of Western influence upon Chinese society. And China was racked, in fact, in the late 19th and early 20th century by a series of such movements that attempted to throw off Western domination, although unsuccessfully at this time. In India, the Congress Party was established in the late 19th century. It became the party of Gandhi, and its purpose was ultimately to oust the British from control of India. South Africa, in the early 20th century, the African National Congress, the ANC, the party of Nelson Mandela, was created early in the 20th century during the First World War to try to challenge British control. So much of the reaction against the Europeans begins as early as the late 19th, no later than the early 20th century. It often draws on Western ideas and values, although, as we will see, in the Middle East, there have been also efforts to draw on Islamic roots as a way of challenging the West. Now, these resistance movements by themselves could not have accomplished their purpose at this time, given the power of Western societies. But the West will help. In two world wars, in the Great Depression, the West, the European powers, destroy much of their own preeminence. Britain, in particular, slips from being a world power into being a second-class power in the first half of the 20th century. Those weakening factors of depression and war help undermine the ability of the Europeans to continue to control their colonies. And as a result, starting in 1947 in India, a series of resistance movements will erupt that will finally throw off colonial control in India, Africa, and those parts of Asia, such as Southeast Asia, that were colonized by the Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th century. Yet even then, as we look at leaders like Gandhi and Mao Zedong and Nasser, who's the leader of Egypt, these people seem as diverse as the third world societies that we just talked about. You know, Gandhi's a pacifist. Mao believes in revolution comes out of, or power comes out of the barrel of a gun. These people seem, as diverse as we talked about at the beginning of the course. So can we say in the end that these new third world societies that emerge in the second half of the 20th century, do they really reflect a common experience of Western domination? And the answer is yes, despite their seeming ideological diversity, from an Arab nationalist like Nasser to a communist like Mao to a pacifist like Gandhi. You look at third world movements after 1947, and we see these common factors. One, these movements, as diverse as they have been devoted to national liberation, throwing off foreign control. In addition to national liberation, they have committed themselves, however unevenly, to incorporating their own people into their society. In other words, to creating inclusive social systems, as opposed to the exclusive colonial systems that ruled them and treated them as second-class citizens. In addition to that, there is a strong element of egalitarianism, of creating more equal societies. And again, to say, well, they're still very unequal. Sure they are. Just as in this society we aspire to individual freedom and equality, we're still on the road, right? So are they. But there is a strong element of egalitarianism, seeking equality, in addition to incorporating people and to create movements for national liberation, and to create a sense of national identity. Finally, a commitment to economic development. Again, here we find there and in the ideas of egalitarianism strong elements of roots in the West, influences from the West. But these factors, national liberation, incorporating people into their society more fully, egalitarian societies, and economic development, form the core of third world nationalism. As the United States emerges as the dominant world power after 1945, it will see laying before it in the decades ahead a series of new nations emerging in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and as diverse as they are ideologically, from communism to Arab nationalism to pacifism, they share in common these characteristics drawn from their experience in the West, or with the West, I should say, of rejecting Western domination, of seeking more egalitarian societies, of trying to achieve economic development and create more inclusive societies. These are the systems, however ideologically diverse they are, that the United States is about to confront and try to incorporate into a world system it will attempt to create over the next half century. Next time we're going to look at, okay, what is the specific response of the United States? What has been the U.S. response towards countries overseas, and particularly third world countries? Then we'll have two pieces of the puzzle put together to focus on the CIA and what its role has been in the effort of the U.S. to pursue its foreign policy in the third world. Next time, we'll get to U.S. foreign policy and specifically its application to third world countries.